My name is Lieutenant Commander Ember Kidd. I'm 32 years old, and I'm in the United States Navy. I've spent my career confronting invisible threats in cyberspace, protecting our nation from windowless rooms on the other side of the globe. But today, my enemy wasn't halfway around the world. He was standing 10 feet away from me in the Culpeper County Courthouse in Virginia, and he was my own father. The judge's gavel struck the sound block, the crack echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Case 13-42. Thomas Kidd versus Lieutenant Commander Ember Kidd. The charge: fraudulent manipulation of a will. I stood perfectly still. The whole room turned to look. My father, Thomas, rose and pointed a finger straight at me. In front of reporters and our lifelong neighbors, his voice rang out, sharp as a shard of broken glass. There she is, the liar who tricked a dying old man for his money. All those uniforms and medals are just a cover for a heart rotten with greed. She's no longer my daughter. My mother sat beside him, her head bowed, while my brother, Dean, just smirked. They thought they had me cornered, that this public humiliation would be the thing that finally broke me. But they didn't know about the final letter my grandfather left behind, the one tucked away in his old Bible. Before I tell you what was in that letter and how it exposed a dark family secret, let me know what time it is where you're listening to this story. Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever been turned into the enemy by your own family, just because you refused to live the life they wanted for you. This story is for the reclamation of honor. The silence that followed my father's declaration was a living thing. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on the entire courtroom. Then, like a dam breaking, it shattered into a wave of whispers. The sound washed over me, a cascade of hushed murmurs and rustling fabric as dozens of heads turned in my direction. In that moment, under the flat, merciless glare of the fluorescent lights, I felt utterly naked, stripped bare in a public square built of polished wood and judgment. I didn't look at my father. I couldn't. Instead, my eyes found my mother. She kept her head bowed, her shoulders trembling beneath her beige cardigan. For a wild, desperate second, I thought she was crying for me, for the daughter she was watching get torn apart by her own husband. But then I saw the truth in the rigid set of her posture. It wasn't grief, it was shame. The deep, burning shame of a woman mortified by a public scene. To my right, I heard a low chuckle. It was my brother, Dean, leaning toward his lawyer. "See?" he whispered, his voice thick with satisfaction. "The show's just getting started." The betrayal wasn't a single wound. It was a coordinated assault from every direction. I stood there, a solitary island in a sea of familiar, yet suddenly foreign faces. My training kicked in, a muscle memory from years of discipline. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and held a posture as rigid and unyielding as the mast of a ship in a hurricane. It was the only armor I had left. When the judge called for a recess, the walk out into the main hallway felt like a mile-long gauntlet. Every conversation ceased the moment I stepped through the double doors. I could feel their eyes on my back, dozens of them. A physical weight of curiosity, pity, and thinly veiled contempt. I saw my father's lawyer, a man named Clifford with a practiced, somber expression, speaking to a reporter from a local news channel. A camera was pointed right at him. "This is a family tragedy," Clifford said, his voice oozing with false sympathy. "My client, Mr. Kidd, simply wants to protect his father's legacy from insatiable greed." Every word was another turn of the knife my father had just plunged into me. I had to push through the small crowd that had gathered, the air thick with their unspoken opinions. It felt like wading through a swamp. And then I saw her, Mrs. Miller. She'd lived 2 houses down from us my entire childhood. She was the one who baked me gingerbread cookies every Christmas and brought over a casserole when I had the chicken pox. She was standing with her husband near the water fountain. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I saw a flicker of recognition, of shock, and then nothing. She turned her head away so quickly it was almost violent, grabbing her husband's arm and pulling him toward the exit, pretending she hadn't seen me at all. That single, simple act of avoidance hurt more than my father's venom. His hatred was a familiar fire I had learned to navigate. But the cold indifference from someone who once represented kindness and community? That was a new kind of pain. It confirmed my new status. I wasn't just disowned by my family, I was being erased by my town. I finally made it outside to the parking lot. The Virginia summer sun was blindingly bright, but a deep, unshakable chill had settled into my bones. I fumbled for the keys to my old Jeep, my fingers feeling clumsy and disconnected from my brain. I got in and slammed the door shut, the sound a dull thud that sealed me inside my own temporary steel and glass sanctuary. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel, the plastic warm against my skin. My breathing was shallow, coming in ragged, desperate gasps. I told myself to breathe. Control what you can control. Your breathing, your posture. A core tenet from SEER training: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. Don't let them see you break. But there were no enemies to evade here, no one to resist but the crushing weight in my own chest. I didn't cry. The shock had frozen the tears somewhere deep inside me. In the rearview mirror, I watched my parents' sedan pull out of its spot and drive away. They didn't even glance in my direction. In that moment, the feeling was absolute. I was an orphan, cast off by the very people who gave me life. The quiet, insidious feeling of worthlessness that my father had spent years cultivating in me had finally found fertile ground. It began to take root. My hand trembled as I put the key in the ignition. Where was I supposed to go? Back to the sterile, empty apartment I was renting? To a dark bar on Main Street to try and drown the day in bourbon? No. Neither felt right. There was only one place. I started the engine and pulled out, turning not toward my apartment, but toward the old county road that led away from town, toward a small winding dirt path that snaked through the trees. It led to a rustic log cabin perched on the banks of the Rappahannock River, my grandfather's house. The only place on earth I had never been judged. The only place I had ever felt truly and unconditionally home. As my Jeep's tires crunched over the familiar gravel of his driveway, the sound seemed to unlock something in my memory. The suffocating present dissolved, and a memory from years ago rushed in, as vivid and painful as if it had happened only yesterday. The memory wasn't summoned, it ambushed me. It was the crunch of the gravel under my tires that did it. A sound so deeply tied to this place, to him, that it acted as a key. Unlocking a door in my mind I tried to keep bolted shut. The humid Virginia air in the present faded, replaced by the crisp autumn chill of a decade ago. I was no longer a lieutenant commander fleeing a courtroom, but a brand new ensign, fresh out of the Naval Academy, driving this same road with a fragile, hopeful heart and a homemade pumpkin pie sitting on the passenger seat. It was my first Thanksgiving home in 4 years. The house smelled exactly as it should have, a rich, intoxicating blend of roasting turkey, savory stuffing, and the sweet spice of cinnamon and nutmeg. It was the scent of home, of tradition, of belonging. But scents can be deceiving. The air was warm with the aroma of cooking, but the atmosphere inside was cold enough to frost glass. My father, Thomas, was in his usual spot, sunk into his leather armchair, eyes glued to the football game on TV. He offered a dismissive wave in my direction without turning his head. "Ember," he grunted, his attention already back on the screen. In the kitchen, my mother was a blur of frantic energy, a tense, brittle smile plastered on her face as she juggled pots and pans. "Oh, good, you're here," she said, her voice tight. "The gravy still needs to be whisked." Only my grandfather seemed genuinely happy to see me. He rose slowly from his chair by the fireplace, his old bones protesting, but his eyes were bright. He wrapped me in a hug that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, his embrace a small warm harbor in a cold sea. "There she is," he whispered, his voice raspy but full of pride. "You look every bit the officer, Ember. I'm so proud of you." For a fleeting moment, holding on to him, I felt the chill recede. I allowed myself to believe that this time might be different, that my uniform, the gold bar on my collar, might finally be enough. But that flicker of joy was short-lived. As soon as we sat down at the dining table, my father sharpened his knives. Not just for the turkey, but for me. The assault began before I'd even had a chance to unfold my napkin. So, my father started, his tone deceptively casual as he surveyed the table. What's an ensign's salary these days? He didn't wait for an answer. It wasn't a real question. It was an opening salvo. Probably not enough to rent a decent place, huh? He continued, spearing a slice of white meat with a large fork. Dean just closed an insurance deal last week. His commission alone was more than your entire year's salary. He said it with a smug satisfaction, placing the slice of turkey onto his plate with a flourish, as if he were presenting a winning argument. Across the table, my brother Dean, older and already starting to go soft around the middle, just shrugged, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. I just work smart, not hard, Dean added, echoing our father's long-held philosophy. Every word was a carefully aimed dart, intended to diminish my choices, to reframe my commitment to service into a narrative of financial failure. I clenched my fists under the table, forcing my voice to remain steady. Dad, I didn't choose this path for the money. My father let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound of pure derision. Oh, so it's for the glory then, he sneered. To see the world and have no responsibilities? While your brother is here, at home, building a real career, preparing to take care of a family, you're off playing soldier somewhere on the other side of the planet. Such a waste. My grandfather tried to intervene, his voice tired but firm. Thomas, the girl is serving our country. But my father waved his hand, dismissing him as if he were a bothersome fly. Serving? He scoffed, his voice rising. She's running from responsibility, is what she is. He paused, looking from me to Dean, his expression hardening as he delivered the killing blow, the line that would echo in my mind for years. At least I have one son who knows how to make real money, not collect a government handout. The words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. I turned my head, my eyes desperately seeking out my mother, sending a silent, frantic plea for help. For a word of defense, for anything. But she wouldn't meet my gaze. Her eyes were fixed on the pool of cranberry sauce on her plate, as if it held the secrets to the universe. She picked up her fork, nudged a piece of stuffing, and spoke in a monotone, lifeless voice. Eat up, everyone, before the food gets cold. Her silence was louder than my father's cruelty. It was the final, definitive betrayal. In that instant, I understood with chilling clarity that I had no allies at this table, save for the frail old man sitting beside me, whose influence had long since waned. I was utterly alone, an island of blue and gold in a hostile sea. I picked up my own fork and took a bite of turkey. The meat, which had smelled so wonderful just moments before, tasted like ash in my mouth, as bitter as poison. I had been trained at the academy to face down enemies, to stand firm in the face of adversity. But no one ever taught me how to defend myself against the quiet, relentless cruelty of your own family, on a day that was supposed to be about gratitude. If you've ever had a moment where a favorite food was ruined by bitter words, hit that like button to show your support. And tell me in the comments, what's one food that holds a powerful memory for you? I want to know I'm not alone in this. That sentence, not collect a government handout, was the verdict he'd passed on me years ago. It branded my service, my sacrifice, as something cheap, something to be ashamed of. As I sat there in my grandfather's cabin, the ghost of that Thanksgiving dinner swirling around me, I knew that moment was the beginning. It was the moment I understood that my honor was something I would have to build for myself, a fortress so strong that the arrows of his words and his money could never breach its walls again. That bitter Thanksgiving was a line in the sand. My father's final words that day, dismissing my service as a government handout, became the foundation stone for the fortress I would build around my heart. I left for my first duty station with a quiet, burning resolve. If my value wasn't going to be recognized in my own home, I would forge it myself, piece by piece, in the one place where merit was the only currency that mattered, the United States Navy. My path led me thousands of miles away, to Naples, Italy, assigned to the headquarters of the U.S. 6th Fleet. My arena wasn't a battlefield of sand and rock, but one of signals and data. The glory, if you could call it that, wasn't found in front of cheering crowds or news cameras. It was found in a place called a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. The easiest way to describe it is as a cold, windowless vault where your personal phone is locked away, where there is no contact with the outside world, and where the only light comes from the glow of computer monitors. This was my world. The constant low hum of servers was the soundtrack to my life. My computer screen was my battleground. My team and I were digital sentinels, tasked with sifting through terabytes of raw data, an endless river of information flowing from Eastern Europe and the Middle East. We were hunters, searching for the faintest digital footprints, the whispers of cyber espionage, the telltale signs of a potential threat to our ships and sailors at sea. There were nights that bled into mornings, 20-hour shifts fueled by potent Italian espresso, so thick and dark it felt like drinking electricity, and handfuls of protein bars eaten without ever looking away from the screen. Every analysis, every report, every decision I made carried a weight that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The safety of thousands of personnel could depend on our ability to see the pattern in the noise. In that room, no one cared who my father was. No one asked about the size of my bank account. They cared about one thing and one thing only: the quality of my work and the integrity of my word. My honor wasn't something I inherited. It was something I earned every single day in that cold, quiet room. My commanding officer was Colonel Miller, a man carved from granite and discipline. He was a classic old-school officer who spoke little and smiled even less. Praise from him was a rare and precious commodity. For months, my work was met with a simple, non-committal nod. But I kept at it, driven by a need to prove not just to him, but to myself, that my father was wrong. Then came the day I found it, a subtle anomaly in a stream of encrypted data, a digital thread that, when pulled, unraveled a significant security vulnerability, a backdoor that more senior analysts had overlooked. It was a critical find, one that could have been exploited with devastating consequences. The next morning, Colonel Miller called me into his office. I stood at attention in front of his desk, my heart pounding, expecting a detailed debriefing. He didn't say much. He simply opened a desk drawer, pulled out a heavy, ornate medallion, and slid it across the polished surface of his desk. It was the unit's challenge coin. "Good work, kid," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You saved us from one hell of a mess." I picked up the coin. The cold, heavy metal felt more valuable in my hand than any paycheck I had ever received. In the civilian world, it was just a piece of metal. But in our world, it was everything. It was a tangible piece of respect, a symbol of belonging earned through competence. It was recognition from a commander, from a fellow warrior. It was the proof I had been so desperate for. My mind, my dedication, my service, it all had real, measurable value. That Christmas, stationed in Naples, I felt the familiar pang of loneliness that hits every service member deployed during the holidays. I scheduled a video call home, a small flicker of hope in my chest that this achievement might finally be something my father could understand. The screen flickered to life, revealing my family's living room, decorated for the holidays. I could see the Christmas tree blinking in the background. I was practically bursting with the news. "Hey everyone, I have something amazing to tell you," I started, my voice full of excitement. "Colonel Miller, my CO, he gave me a challenge coin for the project I've been working on. Dad, I found this." My father cut me off, his voice laced with impatience. All right, spare us the technical jargon, it's all Greek to me," he said, waving a dismissive hand at the camera. "That's nice, honey. Now tell us, have you done any shopping over there? Your mother wants a real leather handbag from Italy, not some knockoff." The air went out of my lungs. My mother quickly changed the subject, asking about the weather. Dean started bragging about the new SUV he'd just bought himself as an early Christmas present, and I just sat there, in my small apartment an ocean away, staring at the pixelated faces of my family. My greatest professional accomplishment, the single proudest moment of my career, had been brushed aside as boring chatter, less interesting than a shopping trip. The fortress I'd been so carefully building suddenly felt like it was made of sand. After the call ended, a familiar sense of desolation washed over me. I walked over to my desk and opened a small wooden box my grandfather had sent me before he passed. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was his old brass compass and a small framed copy of a speech. It was Theodore Roosevelt's The Man in the Arena. My eyes found the familiar words, and I read them aloud in the quiet room. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails, while daring greatly. A current of strength shot through me, pushing back the despair. My father, my brother, they were the critics. They were the ones sitting safely in the stands, pointing fingers and passing judgment. But me? I was in the arena. My face might be marred by exhaustion, my spirit bruised by their words, but I was the one in the fight. I was the one daring greatly. I looked from the framed speech to the complex, glowing map of naval operations on my computer screen, a web of assets and threats spanning half the globe. This was my arena. And I would never, ever let the critics win. I spent the rest of that afternoon in my grandfather's cabin, feeling like a ghost haunting the rooms of my own past. The silence was a heavy blanket, and the loneliness was a physical ache in my chest. Just as I was about to surrender to the overwhelming despair, my phone buzzed on the old wooden table beside me. I glanced at it, expecting another text of pity or a news alert about the case. Instead, it was a message from an unknown number. Lieutenant Commander Kidd, my name is Paul Green. I was a friend of your grandfather's. Meet me at the daily grind if you have the time. The name resonated deep in my memory. Retired Navy Captain Paul Green. My grandfather's closest friend, his confidant from their early days in the service. I hadn't seen him in years. A flicker of something, not quite hope, but curiosity, cut through the fog of my misery. The Daily Grind was a small coffee shop run by veterans just outside Quantico. It was a place of quiet understanding, where soldiers could sit with their coffee and share stories that civilians would never comprehend. It felt like a safe harbor. I drove there, my Jeep's engine a low hum against the quiet country roads. I found the coffee shop tucked away in a small strip mall, a simple American flag flying proudly out front. When I pushed the door open, the warm smell of dark roast coffee and freshly baked pastries enveloped me. The place was quiet, with a few older men in veterans' caps talking softly at a corner table. A man with silver-white hair and a ramrod-straight posture, even in his 70s, rose from a small table by the window as I entered. His eyes, clear and sharp, held a mixture of kindness and an unmistakable command authority. It was Captain Green. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice a deep, comforting baritone. He extended a hand, and his handshake was firm, steady. "Your grandfather told me a great deal about you. All of it good." We sat down with 2 mugs of black coffee between us, the steam rising in the quiet air. I was prepared to explain, to lay out the humiliating details of the day, to defend myself. But I didn't have to. Captain Green seemed to see right through the turmoil to the heart of the matter. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze steady. "I knew your father, Thomas, when he was just a boy," he said, a sad, knowing look in his eyes. He shook his head slightly. "He was always trying to fill a hole that was too big, a shadow too long. He was jealous of his own father. And now, he's jealous of you." The words landed with a quiet, profound impact. For the first time, someone had spoken the truth that I had felt my entire life, but had never dared to name. It was a truth I'd often accused myself of imagining, of being too sensitive. Hearing it stated so plainly, so matter-of-factly, was like a heavy weight being lifted from my soul. I didn't have to argue or justify myself. I just sat there, in the quiet warmth of the coffee shop, and felt the immense relief of being truly understood. We sat in a comfortable silence for a few moments, the unspoken truth settling between us. Then he looked at me, his expression softening, and he asked the question that would undo me completely. "Your father," he began, his voice gentle but direct. "Did he ever attend one of your promotion ceremonies, Ember?" The question was so simple, yet it struck me with the force of a physical blow. I froze, my hand hovering over my coffee mug. I stared down into the black liquid, the surface reflecting a distorted version of my face. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of my unspoken answer. Of course, I had known, on some level. But I had never allowed myself to line up the facts, to see the patterns so clearly. My graduation from the academy, my commissioning as an ensign, my promotions to lieutenant junior grade, and then to full lieutenant. Not once. Not a single time had he been there. There was always a critical meeting, an unavoidable business trip, some plausible excuse that I had accepted because the alternative was too painful to confront. A single, hot tear escaped and rolled down my cheek, splashing into my coffee. Then another. The dam of composure I had so carefully constructed at the courthouse finally broke. The tears I'd frozen with shock began to thaw and flow, silent tears of grief for a father's approval I had never received. Captain Green didn't offer any empty platitudes or clumsy words of comfort. He simply reached across the table and quietly placed a clean, folded napkin in front of me. He gave me the one thing I needed most in that moment, the space to finally feel the full depth of that old, aching wound. When the tears subsided, a quiet calm settled over me. Before we stood to leave, Captain Green reached into a worn leather briefcase at his side and pulled out a small, handsome wooden box. It was dark, polished oak, the kind my grandfather used to keep his medals in. He slid it across the table to me. "Your grandfather asked me to hold this for you," he said, his voice low and serious. "He told me to give it to you when the storm came." He looked me straight in the eye. He knew your father, Ember. He knew this was coming. He then stood up and placed a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a light, polite touch. It was a firm, grounding pressure, a gesture that was strong, supportive, and deeply paternal. "Don't you let them break you, Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice resonating with the conviction of a lifelong leader. "Your honor was forged in fire. Theirs is just empty words." I drove back to my grandfather's cabin with the wooden box resting on the passenger seat. I held the steering wheel with one hand and kept the other protectively on the box, my fingers tracing the smooth, cool wood. For the first time since that gavel had fallen, I didn't feel the crushing weight of being alone. The road ahead was still uncertain, the battle far from over. But now, I had an ally. I had a second father. And in the box beside me, I had a legacy. And maybe, just maybe, the weapon I needed to fight back. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended animation, the wooden box from Captain Green sitting unopened on my grandfather's dusty desk. It felt like the final move in a chess game I wasn't yet ready to play. I needed to understand my opponent's strategy first. The answer came on the third day, in the form of a phone call from a number I knew all too well, my father. I let it ring 3 times before answering, my own training kicking in, never appear too eager. "Ember," he said. His voice was unnervingly pleasant, coated in a thick, artificial sweetness that set my teeth on edge. It was his deal-closing voice, the one he used on clients, not on his own daughter. "I think it's time we put all this ugliness behind us. Let's have dinner tonight, just the family. We'll talk." Morton's Steakhouse, 8 o'clock. Morton's? Of course. It was his power play restaurant, a place of dark wood, leather banquettes, and hushed, important conversations. It wasn't a place for family. It was a place for transactions. My mind screamed trap, every instinct honed by years of intelligence analysis flashing red alerts. But a small, stupid, treacherous part of my heart, a part I thought had been long since extinguished, flickered with a tiny ember of hope. What if he wants to apologize? What if this is his way of reaching out? It was a foolish thought, but the longing for a father's acceptance runs deep. Against my better judgment, I heard myself agree. The moment I walked into the restaurant, that flicker of hope was snuffed out. It wasn't just the family. Seated at a large round table in a secluded corner were my father, my brother Dean, and their lawyer, Clifford. The table was set for a business meeting, not a reconciliation. There were leather-bound folders and pens neatly arranged next to the steak knives. No apologies, no warmth, just the cold, predatory stillness of a boardroom. My father gestured to the empty chair. "Ember, you're here. Good. Let's get straight to it," he began, foregoing any pretense of a family dinner. "We're here to make you a fair offer, to put an end to all this noise and get back to our lives." I sat down, my posture rigid, my hands folded calmly in my lap. Inside, a cold knot was tightening in my stomach. The waiter approached, but my father waved him away impatiently. This was not about dinner. Clifford, the lawyer, cleared his throat and slid one of the leather folders across the table toward me. He opened it, revealing a document filled with dense legal text. "We are prepared to withdraw the lawsuit," he said, his voice smooth and rehearsed. "In exchange, upon the settlement of the estate, Ms. Kidd will receive a one-time payment of 15% of the total value, after all legal fees and expenses have been deducted." He smiled, a thin reptilian gesture. "A very generous sum for someone in your position, I might add." 15%. The number hung in the air, a stunning, calculated insult. Not 50, not even 25, 15. It wasn't a settlement, it was a handout. The scraps from their table. I felt the blood drain from my face, replaced by a rising tide of ice-cold fury. My father leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescension, as if he were bestowing a great gift upon a beggar. "Consider it your share, Ember. Something to help you out with retirement after you're done with the Navy. A gesture of goodwill." I slowly lifted my eyes from the document and looked directly at him. My voice, when I spoke, was dangerously quiet. "This was never about the money," I said. Dean let out a sudden barking laugh that made heads turn at nearby tables. "Oh, come on, Ember, cut the act," he sneered, his face a mask of arrogant amusement. "Of course it's about the money. Get real. You're a soldier. What could you possibly know about managing a major estate? You should just take the money and let the men handle the rest of it." The words struck me harder than any physical blow. It wasn't just the dismissal of my career. It was the raw, unvarnished contempt for my intelligence, for my gender. It was the belief, so deeply ingrained in him, that I was fundamentally incapable. I looked at my father, waiting for him to object, to defend his own daughter from such a vile insult. He just nodded in agreement. "He's right, Ember," my father said, his expression flat. "This is a man's world. You wouldn't understand the complexities involved." That was it. The final straw. The point of no return. In that moment, a strange and terrifying calm washed over me. The hurt, the shock, the desperate need for their approval. It all vanished, burned away by a clean, white-hot rage. I remembered a lesson from hostage negotiation training. You never negotiate your core values with a terrorist. And right now, my honor was the hostage. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly, my movements deliberate. I looked at the three of them, my father, my brother, my enemy. Their faces a mixture of surprise and smug confidence. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. I let my gaze rest on each of them for a moment. "You didn't bring me here to reconcile. You brought me here to surrender. You want to buy my silence and desecrate my grandfather's final wishes with a payoff." I then turned my full attention to my father, the man who had given me life and then spent a lifetime trying to take my spirit. "Your offer isn't just an insult to me," I said, each word precise and final. "It is an insult to his memory." I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on them, on their steak dinner, on their dirty deal, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them sitting in a stunned, gaping silence. The cool night air hit my face, but I barely felt it. I got in my Jeep and drove, my hands steady on the wheel. When I got back to my small, rented apartment, I walked in and shut the door behind me. The slam echoed through the empty rooms, a sharp, definitive sound that was both an ending and a beginning. The negotiations were over. The war had just begun. And in the sudden, ringing silence, my eyes fell upon the dark oak box sitting on my counter. The slam of my apartment door echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. For a long moment, I stood there in the entryway, my back pressed against the wood, my entire body vibrating with a rage so pure and cold, it felt like a chemical reaction in my veins. The carefully constructed discipline of a career naval officer, the years spent learning to control my emotions, all of it was stripped away, leaving only the raw, wounded core of a daughter who had been betrayed one final, unforgivable time. My breath came in ragged gasps. I wanted to scream. I wanted to punch a wall. I wanted to break something, just to hear a sound that matched the shattering inside my own chest. My eyes scanned the small, impersonal room, searching for an anchor in the storm of my fury. And then I saw it. Sitting on the kitchen counter, where I'd left it after my meeting with Captain Green, was the dark oak box. A new kind of energy, sharp and focused, cut through the chaotic anger. I moved toward it, not with desperation, but with purpose. The rage was still there, but it was no longer a wildfire. It was being channeled, forged into something else, something harder. My hands were trembling as I lifted the lid. The air filled instantly with the ghost of my grandfather, the rich, comforting scent of aged oak, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet aroma of the pipe tobacco he used to smoke on the porch. It was so real, so tangible, that I half expected to turn and see him sitting in his armchair. For a moment, I felt like a child again, safe in his presence. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling as though I was about to dive into the deep, dark water of the past, unsure of what treasures or wreckage I might find. Resting on top was a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a wax stamp of his initials, RK. In his familiar, slightly shaky but still decisive handwriting were the words, "For Ember, when the storm comes." My fingers trembled as I broke the seal. "My dearest granddaughter," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my greatest fear has come to pass. Your father's pride and the envy he has carried his entire life like a stone in his heart has finally clouded his reason completely." I sank onto a kitchen stool, the letter shaking in my hands. He had known. All this time, he had known. He went on to explain that in his final months, he had seen the bitterness in his son's eyes with a clarity that old age sometimes brings. He knew Thomas would never accept the will. He knew a fight was coming. "I am not leaving you this inheritance to punish him, Ember," he wrote. "I am leaving it to you because you are the only one who understands its true value. It is not about the land or the money. It has always been about honor. You live by a code he and your brother have long since forgotten." Tears began to blur the words on the page. Then I read the final lines, and a sob caught in my throat, raw and painful. "Your father is a good man who was lost to his own fear. But you, Ember, you were made from the steel of battleships. Never, for 1 second, doubt that." I wept then, not for myself, but for him. For his love, for his unshakable faith in me. The tears were a release, washing away the last vestiges of doubt and hurt, leaving behind a foundation of pure, unyielding resolve. I was not the greedy, manipulative liar my father painted me to be. I was the steel of battleships, and it was time to prove it. Wiping my eyes with the back of my hand, I put the letter aside. The emotional storm had passed. The intelligence officer had taken command. I compartmentalized the grief and turned my attention to the rest of the box's contents. Beneath the letter was a handsome, leather-bound journal, his old Montblanc pen resting beside it. I opened it. It was his diary from the last 6 months of his life. With meticulous care, he had documented everything. His handwriting was a testament to his state of mind, clear and lucid. One entry read, "Thomas visited today. Spoke again of optimizing the assets. He wants to sell the North Pasture for a housing development. He doesn't understand that soil is our history. It's where this family began." Another, from a few weeks later, Dean stopped by, asked for a loan to buy a new sports car. When I refused, he pouted like a child and didn't speak to me for the rest of the week. He sees this family's legacy as his personal ATM. Each entry was a piece of the puzzle, a brick in the wall of evidence against their claims of his incompetence. But the final, irrefutable proof was the smallest item in the box, a tiny black USB flash drive. I took it to my laptop, my heart hammering against my ribs. I inserted it, and a single video file appeared on the screen. The file name was Final Directive. I clicked play. My grandfather's face filled the screen. He was in his study, sitting at his desk, speaking into his webcam. He looked frail, his voice was weaker than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and utterly clear. The date stamp in the corner of the video was from 1 week before he passed away. His lawyer was on the other end of the call, his voice audible. "I just want to confirm this one last time, Robert," the lawyer said. "Let's be perfectly clear," my grandfather responded, his voice steady and firm despite its thinness. "My entire estate, every acre, every dollar, is to be transferred to my granddaughter, Lieutenant Commander Ember Kidd." He leaned closer to the camera, his gaze piercing. "The reason is simple. She lives by a code of honor. My 2 sons, sadly, do not. I will not have my life's work, my legacy, turned into a commodity to be carved up and sold off by men who value nothing but money." The video ended. I sat there, stunned into silence. The truth was overwhelming. My grandfather hadn't just left me his property. He had left me a fully prepared battle plan. He had anticipated every move my father would make and had provided the perfect counterattack. The anger in my chest had now cooled into a singular, chilling purpose. I was no longer the defendant in a humiliating lawsuit. I was the executor of my grandfather's last will and testament. I was the instrument of his justice. He gave me the mission, and now he'd given me the weapons to complete it. For anyone who has ever had to fight for what is right, for anyone who knows that some things are more important than money, you know the feeling that was surging through me. It was the calm before the righteous storm. If you believe that a person's true legacy is the honor they leave behind, hit that like button and comment with a single word. Honor. Let them hear us. I picked up my phone, my hand perfectly steady. I found the number for my lawyer. She answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Henderson," I said, my voice calm, level, and as cold as steel. "It's Ember Kidd. We have work to do." The next morning, I drove north on Route 29, leaving the small-town claustrophobia of Culpeper behind. As the landscape shifted from rolling Virginia hills to the dense, powerful architecture of Washington, D.C., I felt a corresponding shift within myself. The closer I got to the city, the more the last vestiges of the wounded daughter fell away, replaced by the focused mind of Lieutenant Commander Kidd. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing to act. Stepping into Sarah Henderson's law office on K Street was like stepping into another world. The oppressive wood-paneled gloom of the Culpeper courthouse was replaced by floor-to-ceiling windows, bright sunlight, and a vibrant energy that seemed to hum in the air. Her office was modern, sharp, and commanded a sweeping view of the city's monuments. It was the office of a woman who was used to fighting and winning on a national stage. Sarah Henderson greeted me not with pity, but with a firm handshake and a direct gaze. She was a woman in her late 40s with a sharp intelligence in her eyes that I recognized immediately. She was a former Navy JAG officer, and she carried herself with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who understands the chain of command and the importance of a clear objective. "You said you had something," she said, getting straight to the point. "Let's see it." In the sterile quiet of her conference room, I laid out the contents of the oak box on the gleaming glass table. The letter, the leather-bound journal, and the small black USB drive. I said nothing, letting the evidence speak for itself. She read the letter first, her expression unreadable. Then she carefully paged through my grandfather's journal, her brow furrowed in concentration. Finally, I handed her my laptop, the video file queued up and ready. She watched the 90-second clip in complete silence. As my grandfather's clear, resolute voice filled the room, I saw a slow, dangerous smile spread across Sarah Henderson's face. When the video ended, she leaned back in her chair and let out a low whistle. "Good Lord, Lieutenant Commander," she said, shaking her head in disbelief. "This isn't just evidence. This is a nuclear bomb." She looked at me, her eyes alight with a lawyer's predatory glee. "They're done. They just don't know it yet." A wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled my knees, washed over me. For the first time, I felt the solid ground of certainty beneath my feet. Sarah leaned forward, her expression turning from triumphant to one of genuine admiration. They underestimated you, Lieutenant Commander, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Badly. They looked at you and saw a daughter they could bully, a soldier they could dismiss. They didn't see an information warfare officer, someone trained day in and day out to analyze deception and counter it with strategy. She locked her eyes on mine. That is going to be their fatal mistake. Her words were a validation that went deeper than any medal or commendation. All the years I had spent feeling that my life's work was invisible to my family, all the skills they had mocked or ignored, Sarah Henderson saw them not as a liability, but as a strategic advantage. My career wasn't just a job. It was my armor, and it was my sword. And in this battle, the most important one of my life, I was finally on a familiar field. So, what's our plan? I asked, my voice steady. We show this to the judge now. Get the case thrown out. No, Sarah said instantly, holding up a hand. That's not the plan. That's a skirmish. We're planning for a decisive victory. She stood up and began to pace, the energy in the room crackling. Your father and brother have built their entire case on a foundation of lies, that your grandfather was mentally incompetent and that you are a manipulative predator. We don't just want to poke a hole in their story. We want to let them build it as high as they possibly can. She stopped and turned to me, her eyes shining. We let them present their entire case. We let their lawyer paint his masterpiece of deception for the judge and the jury of public opinion. We let them get comfortable, confident, arrogant. We let them build a tower of lies so tall that when we finally detonate this bomb, the collapse will be catastrophic. It will be so loud, so complete, that no one will ever doubt the truth again. I nodded slowly, a cold smile touching my own lips. I understood this strategy perfectly. In the Navy, we called it setting a kill box. You identify the enemy's path, you let them advance, you let them walk right into the trap that their own arrogance has created for them. Then, and only then, do you spring it. We control the information, I said, the core principle of my profession. And by controlling the information, we control the battlefield. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. The days that followed were a blur of focused, relentless preparation. We were no longer just a client and a lawyer, we were a two-woman tactical team. We made notarized copies of every page of the journal. We took a formal videotaped deposition from Captain Paul Green, in which he authenticated the journal and testified to my grandfather's sharp state of mind and his growing concerns about his sons. We meticulously prepared our cross-examination questions for my father and Dean, designing each one to lead them deeper into their web of lies, to make them commit to their story on the record. I was no longer a grieving victim. I was an active partner in the fight for my own honor, and it felt incredible. The night before the final day of the hearing, I stood in my apartment, the city lights of DC glittering outside my window. The strategic planning was done. The weapons were ready. All that was left was the final preparation for battle. I walked to my closet and opened the door. Hanging there, immaculate in its garment bag, was my Navy Service Dress Blues uniform. The deep, dark blue fabric, the gleaming gold buttons, the crisp white shirt, the neat rows of colored ribbons above the pocket, each one representing a tour, a campaign, a piece of my life they had never bothered to understand. I took it out and hung it on the back of the door. I wouldn't be wearing it to impress anyone or to ask for special treatment. I would be wearing it as a declaration. This uniform was my code, it was my service, it was my truth. It was everything my grandfather had honored in me. It was everything they had tried to take away. And tomorrow, in that courtroom, I would wear it as I took it all back. The final day of the hearing felt like the moment before a storm breaks. The air in the Culpeper County Courthouse was thick with anticipation, heavy and still. Every seat was taken. The local news reporters were there, pens poised over notebooks, cameras ready. I sat beside Sarah Henderson, my back ramrod straight in the starched collar of my service dress blues. I felt strangely calm, like a pilot in the cockpit having run through the pre-flight checklist 100 times. All the variables had been accounted for. All that was left was to fly the mission. On the other side of the aisle, my father and Dean sat with their lawyer, Clifford. They radiated an aura of supreme confidence. They smiled, they whispered to each other. They looked for all the world like men who had already won. Clifford rose for his closing arguments, his voice smooth and oozing with false sincerity. He paced before the judge, a master actor playing his final, dramatic scene. He painted a masterful picture for the court, a narrative of a cunning, tech-savvy daughter, an expert in information warfare, who had used her sophisticated skills to remotely manipulate her frail, elderly grandfather. He spun a tale of a vulnerable old man, confused and isolated, preyed upon by the one person he should have been able to trust. "This is not a case about money, Your Honor," Clifford said, his voice ringing with manufactured passion. "It is a case about the sanctity of a man's final wishes, and the tragedy of a family torn apart by greed." As he spoke, I glanced at my father. He sat there, the very picture of a wronged patriarch, his face a mask of sorrowful dignity. Dean sat beside him, nodding gravely. They had built their tower of lies, brick by deceitful brick, and now they stood atop it, waiting for their coronation. They were so sure of their victory. So beautifully, fatally sure. Clifford concluded with a dramatic flourish and returned to his seat. The courtroom was silent, the weight of his accusations hanging in the air. Judge Whitmore, a man whose face was etched with a lifetime of listening to stories, turned his tired eyes to our table. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Does the defense have anything further to present?" Sarah Henderson stood slowly. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on her lips. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and cutting through the silence. "We do." A ripple of anticipation went through the room. My father's confident expression flickered for the first time. "The defense calls Captain Paul Green, United States Navy, retired," Sarah announced. Captain Green walked to the stand with the steady, dignified bearing of a lifelong officer. He swore his oath, and under Sarah's calm questioning, he confirmed the authenticity of my grandfather's journal. He recounted with quiet authority my grandfather's clear state of mind in his final months. He spoke of my grandfather's deep disappointment and growing alarm over the avarice of his two sons. Clifford leaped up for the cross-examination, attempting to discredit the testimony. "Isn't it true, Captain," he sneered, "that you're talking about the private ramblings of an old, dying man?" "I'm talking about the concerns of my best friend, Counselor," Captain Green replied, his voice like cold iron. "A man who was as sharp at 90 as you'll be at 50. The first brick in their tower had been loosened. The confidence on my father's face was beginning to crack, replaced by a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. But the main assault was yet to come. Sarah Henderson let the tension build for a moment before turning back to the judge. "And now, Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with newfound power, "the defense has one final piece of evidence, a video recording made by the deceased, Mr. Robert Kidd himself, 1 week before he passed away." The courtroom erupted in a wave of murmurs. The reporters leaned forward, scribbling furiously. I saw my father's face drain of all color. He knew. In that instant, he knew the trap had been sprung. The court clerk set up the large monitor. Sarah inserted the USB drive. And then my grandfather's face filled the screen. He was frail, yes, but his eyes were clear, his voice weak but unwavering as it filled the stunned silence of the room. "I want to confirm this one last time," his voice echoed, a ghost speaking the truth. "My entire estate is to be transferred to my granddaughter, Lieutenant Commander Ember Kidd. The reason is simple. She lives by a code of honor. My two sons, sadly, do not. I will not have my life's work, my legacy, turned into a commodity." The video played on, but no one was listening anymore. Every eye in the room, the judge, the reporters, our former neighbors, was locked on my father. His face, once so full of arrogant certainty, had crumpled. It was a ruin of gray, slack-jawed horror. The blood had left it so completely he looked like a statue carved from ash. Beside him, Dean didn't even look up. He had dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking, his entire body surrendering to the crushing weight of exposure. Their magnificent tower of lies had not just cracked, it had been vaporized in 90 seconds. When the video ended, the silence that fell was absolute. It was a heavy, damning silence, more powerful than any shout. Judge Whitmore stared at my father, and for the first time, I saw not just judicial impartiality, but a profound, personal disappointment in his eyes. He had seen enough. He picked up his gavel, the small wooden hammer suddenly feeling like the heaviest object in the world. He didn't need to deliberate. Based on the irrefutable evidence that has just been presented, the judge's voice boomed, hard and final. This court dismisses the plaintiff's case in its entirety. Furthermore, he added, his gaze boring into my father and brother, this court will be referring the matter of Mr. Thomas Kidd and Mr. Dean Kidd to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into charges of perjury and defamation. Gavel! The sound cracked through the courtroom like a rifle shot. It was over. A second, final gavel followed. The sound didn't just end a lawsuit, it ended an era of lies, of arrogance, of disrespect. I sat perfectly still in my chair, the uniform crisp against my skin. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I didn't even look at the wreckage of my family on the other side of the aisle. I just breathed. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt a profound, bottomless, and blessedly silent sense of relief. Justice had been done. My grandfather's honor had been defended. I didn't go to a bar to celebrate. I didn't call my friends to share the news. After the verdict, after the chaotic swirl of reporters and the stunned silence that followed my family out of the courthouse, I just drove. I drove straight back to my grandfather's cabin, the one place on earth that felt like a sanctuary. The uniform, which had felt like armor in the courtroom, now felt heavy, constricting. I changed into an old sweatshirt and a pair of jeans, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease for the first time in weeks. My phone, which I'd left on the kitchen counter, buzzed incessantly. A constant stream of text messages from friends, from colleagues, even a short, congratulatory one from Captain Miller all the way in Naples. Well done, kid. I read it, felt a flicker of warmth, and then turned the phone face down. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. Victory tasted like ash. I sank into my grandfather's worn leather armchair, the one that still held the faint scent of his pipe tobacco, and stared out the window at the Rappahannock River. It flowed on, steady and serene, completely indifferent to the human dramas that played out on its banks. I had won. I had defended my grandfather's name. I had protected his legacy. But in doing so, I had publicly and irrevocably dismantled my own family. There was no going back from this. The feeling wasn't the triumphant elation I had imagined. It was a hollow, cavernous exhaustion. The kind a soldier feels after a long, brutal campaign, when the adrenaline fades and all that's left is the quiet awareness of the cost. I had won the war for my honor, but the price had been my own history, my own blood. The phone rang again, a sharp, insistent sound that shattered the peace. I glanced at the screen. Mom. My heart hammered against my ribs. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it go to voicemail, to preserve the fragile quiet I had found. But another, older part, the part that was still a daughter, took over. I took a deep, steadying breath and answered. The sound that came through the speaker wasn't a voice. It was a sob, a ragged, desperate sound that scraped at my nerves. Ember, darling. She finally managed to get out, her voice thick with tears. Oh, Ember, please, you have to do something. I waited, my own throat tight. Do what, Mom? The charges, the perjury, she cried. Your father, he won't survive this. The shame of it, it'll kill him. Please don't let them do this. Don't tear this family apart any more than it already is. Can't you forgive him? The words were like 1,000 tiny needles, each one finding a raw nerve. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't acknowledging my pain, or the years of dismissal, or the public humiliation she had sat silently and watched. She was asking me, the one who had been attacked, to clean up the mess. She was asking me to carry the emotional weight of my father's downfall, just as she had always expected me to silently carry the weight of his disappointment. I saw it so clearly then. My mother was a victim too, trapped by her fear of my father's moods, of his anger. But her fear had made her an accomplice. Her silence had been the oxygen that allowed his cruelty to burn so brightly for so long. "I have to go, Mom," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I ended the call before she could say another word, my hand trembling as I set the phone back down. I felt completely adrift, caught between the righteous anger I had every right to feel and the crushing guilt her plea was designed to create. The room felt small, the air thick and unbreathable. I opened my laptop, my fingers moving on autopilot, and typed a name into the search bar. Brené Brown. I found the TED Talk I had watched years ago, the one that had resonated so deeply with me at the Naval Academy. I hit play, and her warm, intelligent Texas accent filled the quiet cabin. She spoke of courage, of vulnerability, of the myth that being tough meant never showing weakness. And then she said the words that landed like a flare in the darkness of my mind. "Clear is kind," Brené's voice said through the speakers. "Unclear is unkind. We are not called to be hurtful, but we are called to be clear. And sometimes the most courageous and the kindest thing you can possibly do is to set a boundary." A single, hot tear finally escaped and rolled down my cheek. It was a revelation, a permission slip. All my life, I had thought that keeping the peace by swallowing my feelings was the noble thing to do. But it wasn't noble. It was self-destructive. Brené was right. Kindness wasn't about letting people hurt you repeatedly. True kindness, kindness to myself, was about being clear. Forgiveness didn't mean reopening the door to more pain. It meant finally allowing the wounds to close. Instead of calling my mother back, I opened a blank document. I didn't want a screaming match. I didn't want another round of tears and manipulation. I wanted clarity. I began to write, not a letter of anger, but a letter of truth. I addressed it to all three of them. "I won the case today," I wrote, "but I don't feel like a winner. In the end, we all lost something. Dad, I forgive you. Not because what you did was right, or because it didn't cause a pain so deep I'm not sure it will ever fully heal. I forgive you because I am done carrying the weight of your anger and your disappointment. I'm setting it down. For my own sake. Mom and Dean, I forgive you too. I forgive you for your silence, which was its own kind of weapon. I understand now that you were both acting out of fear, but I can no longer allow that fear to dictate my life." I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was the most important part. "This forgiveness is not an open door," I typed. "It is a door that is closing, peacefully. I need space, and I need time to heal, away from the roles we have all played for so long. When I am ready, if I am ever ready, I will be the one to reach out. I need you to respect that." I read it over one last time, took a deep breath, and hit send. And as the email disappeared into the digital ether, an incredible, profound sense of peace settled over me. The storm inside finally broke. I hadn't just won a lawsuit. I had taken back my own life. I had chosen myself. And I was beginning to understand that maybe that was what honor was really about. The 6 months that followed my email were a season of silence. A quiet, healing silence, not the suffocating kind I had grown up with. I didn't hear from my family, and I didn't reach out. I needed the space, the time to let the dust settle, not just on the legal battle, but on the battlefield of my own heart. I stayed at my grandfather's cabin, the gentle murmur of the Rappahannock becoming the soundtrack to my recovery. The inheritance, the very thing that had been forged into a weapon against me, now sat waiting. For a while, I didn't know what to do with it. The thought of spending it on myself, on a new car or a fancy condo, felt wrong, like a betrayal of the honor I had fought so hard to defend. My grandfather's legacy wasn't about the money. It was about the principles he lived by. And I realized that the only way to truly honor him was to put that legacy into service. I sold off a portion of the land, enough to secure a significant sum, but I kept the cabin and the stretch of garden that ran down to the riverbank. Then I made a call, not to a realtor or a financial advisor, but to a struggling veteran support center over in Fredericksburg, a place I'd read about that was helping former service members who had fallen on hard times. I met with them, and together we drew up a plan. I wouldn't just write a check. I would fund the construction of 2 specific things: a therapeutic garden, a quiet, beautiful space for veterans and their families to find peace, and a pro bono legal clinic to help them fight the kinds of battles they weren't trained for. We would call it the Robert Kidd Legacy Project. I was transforming the poisoned source of my family's conflict into a wellspring of healing for others. It felt right. It felt like coming home to a purpose I hadn't known I was looking for. About a week before the dedication ceremony for the garden, I was sitting on the porch when a car I didn't recognize pulled into the gravel driveway. Dean got out. I hadn't seen him since the courthouse, and the change was startling. He looked a decade older, the arrogant smirk gone, replaced by a weary sadness in his eyes. He seemed smaller somehow. He stood awkwardly at the bottom of the steps. "Dad." "He's not doing so well, Ember," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the wooden planks of the porch. Since everything happened, he just sits. He's eating himself alive with silence." He finally lifted his head and looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in our adult lives. There was no mockery in his eyes, only a raw, clumsy shame. I'm sorry, Ember," he said, the words sounding foreign and difficult on his tongue. "I was a real jerk. I was jealous of you. I think I always have been." It wasn't a grand speech. It was awkward and broken, but it was honest. It was the first crack in the wall of ice that had stood between us for 30 years. I didn't offer him false comfort or easy absolution. I just nodded. "Thank you for telling me, Dean." The dedication ceremony was held on a perfect, crisp autumn afternoon. The Virginia sunlight streamed through the golden leaves, illuminating the newly planted garden. Dozens of veterans, their families, and community members were there. As I stood up to speak about my grandfather's code of honor and service, I scanned the small crowd. And there, standing at the very back, almost hidden by the shade of an old oak tree, was my father. He was dressed simply, in a worn jacket and slacks. He looked thin, gaunt even. He didn't try to approach me, just stood there and watched, his face an unreadable mask of something. It wasn't anger, it wasn't defiance, it was just quiet. After the speeches were done and people were mingling, he made his way toward me. The crowd parted slightly around him. He didn't say a word. He just held out his hand, palm up. When he uncurled his fingers, a glint of old gold lay there. It was my grandfather's U.S. Naval Academy ring, the one my father had inherited. The heavy, iconic ring with the blue stone that symbolized a lifetime of honor. "He would have wanted you to have this," my father said, his voice raspy, broken. "It belongs to you." He didn't look me in the eye. He just gently, carefully, placed the ring in the palm of my hand. The weight of it was immense, far heavier than its physical size. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a surrender. It was an apology. It was an acknowledgement. It was him, in the only way he knew how, finally admitting who the true heir to my grandfather's legacy was. The story ends, as perhaps it should, a few weeks later, back on the porch of the cabin. It was early morning, and I was sipping coffee, the old gold ring now a comfortable weight on my finger. A truck rumbled up the driveway. It was my father. He got out, holding 2 fishing rods. He didn't speak of the past. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just held up one of the rods. "The bass are biting," he said. And so we sat side by side in the morning mist, our lines cast into the quiet waters of the Rappahannock, just as my grandfather and I had done so many times. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a void. It was just quiet. A peaceful, companionable quiet. The storm had passed. The wounds were still there, of course, pale scars that would likely always remain. But they were beginning to heal. As I watched the sun rise over the river, casting a warm golden light over the water, I realized I hadn't just reclaimed my honor. I had, against all odds, found a way for my family, and for myself, to come home. My story started in a courtroom, but the real battle was fought in the quiet moments, learning to forgive, setting boundaries, and redefining what honor truly means. It's not about never falling, It's about how we rise, how we heal, and how we help others stand up alongside us. Thank you for listening and for being a part of this journey back home. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to join a community built on strength and resilience. And in the comments below, I'd be honored if you would share just one word that defines your personal code of honor.